Okay, I'm going to start. We are being recording this, and I do appreciate that some people are time shifting, and we'll watch this later. But it's just with real pleasure and joy that I welcome Bob Schieffer here. Bob Schieffer is the class act of American journalism. With CBS since 1969, anchor of the CBS Evening News for 23 years, chief Washington correspondent. I think many of us all know him as moderator of the Face the Nation show. And also, I don't know if you know this, he's one of the very few journalists ever to have covered all four of the major Washington national assignments, that being the White House, the Pentagon, the Department of State, and the United States Congress. Moderator of the third presidential debate, the one between President George W. Bush and Senator Kerry in Arizona. He's currently on the debate commission, deciding who can debate and what are the policies, and we may get into that. I'm going to not go on more about his amazing career, other than to plug his books. He has several really, really excellent books, including Face the Nation, my favorite stories from the first 50 years of the award-winning news broadcast, This Just In, What I Couldn't Tell You on TV, we're going to ask about that, and Bob Schieffer's American, and I really do look forward to talking about that, and his co-authored book about Ronald Reagan, the acting president. Bob Schieffer, thank you so much for being here. And I would like you to tell us, how has journalism changed?
I will. This is kind of like church. I would like to invite everybody to come on down to the front row.
I love that.
And
I love that. Come up, sit close.
And then those guys that show up late, we'll make them sit in the back.
That's great. Thank you for doing that.
I think it'll be more fun this way.
Cozy.
You know, it's a very good question to start. How has journalism changed? And what has changed is the whole world of communications, which has been turned totally upside down from where it was when I became a reporter some 58 years ago. It all changed when I started out as a newspaper reporter. I worked for Fort Worth Star-Telegram, which was my hometown newspaper. And on the weekend that President Kennedy was assassinated, that is when everything changed. Up until that point, most Americans got their news from print and from the written word. From that weekend on, most Americans, every survey showed, got their news from television. And it remained that way until we entered the age of the digital age. And now we don't know where people get most of their news. They get it from so many different places. We're in a world now. In those days, there were like 4 television stations in every town. Every town had a pretty good sized newspaper and a pretty good newspaper. And now we have 700 choices on the television channel. We're overwhelmed with information, not what I would call news, but information. We're overwhelmed by it. We can't process it. We get so much information, and it goes on for 24 hours a day, and that is what has really changed, Martha. And what all of us in mainstream journalism now are trying to deal with, because there's several things that are going on at one time here. Number one, and what I consider the real crisis in journalism now, is the difficulty that local newspapers are having, just from an economic standpoint. There's a newspaper that collapses or folds or closes every day. The tiny towns where there are very small community newspapers are still doing well, because the people in those towns don't have any place else to advertise, and the local newspaper is still the place where they advertise, and of course that's what makes the newspaper able to survive. But when you get into small to medium-sized towns and all up, every single newspaper is having difficulty trying to figure out some kind of business model to keep those newspapers viable and keep them afloat. And some have cut back I mean, I know newspapers in medium-sized towns that don't even have a city hall reporter anymore. I mean, they send somebody down to cover the city council meeting when it meets, but they don't send somebody down there every day who knows what the whole story is. They don't have courthouse reporters anymore. I've always been a beat reporter, and beats are what made a newspaper great. You know,
Yes.
you had real experts that knew something, and they knew the history, they knew what was going on. You don't have that very much anymore. And I would just say this, and then we'll talk about some other parts of it. If we get to a point in this country where we don't have some entity on the local scene that does what we've come to expect of local newspapers, and that is basically just keep an eye on the local government, we'll have corruption at this town, in this country, at levels we have never seen or experienced. So I think that's where the real crisis of it is. The other part of it, at the national level, our job now in the mainstream media is kind of twofold. It's to correct information, bad information, and there's so much of it that is out there, and try to find some way to break through this just great maw of information and alert people and tell people what we think they need to know. I mean, people turn on the news and watch the news because they think they need to. They think it's going to help them find out something that they need to know. And we're so overwhelmed by all this noise and all these distractions that sometimes it's very, very difficult to do that. And that is what we're dealing with today. It's not just changed. It has been turned upside down. And I don't think any of us saw this coming, even after it started. And I'm not sure where it goes from here.
I have two follow-up questions about that. The local news that you describe is falling away, and that's even local news coverage on other media besides newspapers. And some people have really suggested that that's part of the problem with the criminal justice issues right now, because you don't have beat reporters. And so one question I would have is whether citizen journalists can begin to fill in some of that, or bloggers or others. How do we begin to address that problem?
Well, you know, I think there's going to have to be some entity there, and you know, we're all publishers now. You know, we used to say when I started out, if you got a barrel of ink and a printing press, you're a publisher. You don't need a license to be a publisher of a newspaper. Now you don't need the barrel of ink, and everybody has their own printing press, which is their computer and access to the internet. The great concern that I have about all this is we have come to accept certain standards in the mainstream media, number one of which is, in those days and still in these days, you may not agree with the editorial policy of your local newspaper, but you generally accept as true what they put on the front page and in the news pages. And you take for granted that they wouldn't put it there if they hadn't checked it out. Well, what's happening in so many of these different areas now is the kid, you know, sitting in his mama's basement at 3 o'clock in the morning that thinks he suddenly discovered the meaning of life, and he puts it out on the blog. He's not following those same standards. He's not calling a second source. He's not vetting it. A guy sat down next to me in a delicatessen right around the corner from where CBS is the other day, and said, "I'd just like to introduce myself." Sure. And I said, "Sure." And he said, "I'm an ex-newspaper man." Said, "I've got a job here in working for the government, so at least I've been able to find a job." But said the newspaper where I worked was a large newspaper, the biggest newspaper in the town, and it's a medium-sized town. And he said, in the recent round of layoffs, he said, I was one of those that got laid off. And I said, well, who did they lay off? He said, they laid off all the editors. And I said, what? And he said, yeah. He said, you know, when those reporters go out to cover a story now, what they do is they also take pictures with their phone and so forth, but they are supposed to write their story and put it on the newspaper's website before they come back to the office. And I said, well, who else looks at the story? And he said, no one.
Wow.
The story gets on the website without one single person looking at it. Now, when I was a newspaper person, there were 3 people that looked at every story that went into the paper. The city editor who had assigned it, he gave it over to the news editor that read it, decided where in the newspaper he was going to put it, and assigned whether it'd be a 2-column or a 3-column headline. Then he gave it to the copy editor who did the final editing, checked the grammar and all that kind of stuff, and wrote the headline for the story. At CBS News, obviously, when we do things live, we're doing it in real time, so there's nobody editing that. I mean, but if you make a mistake, they're going to tell you pretty quickly, you better you made a mistake, correct it. But any kind of produced piece that goes on the evening news, at least 3 people are looking at it. And we now have, in some of these newspapers in fairly good-sized towns, that nobody is seeing the copy before it's put out there for the public. And that is dangerous.
That's a big change.
Among other things.
Well, here's another follow-up, and it's related to what you're saying. The distinction between opinion and reporting seems to have dissolved.
I think so.
And, once upon a time, maybe in the 19th century, there wasn't a big belief in objectivity. But
there was no such thing.
There was no such thing. And you had 10, 20 newspapers in a city, and it was each one had different points of view. But then we developed professional journalism and the idea that your goal is to report the truth and the facts. Are we going back to the 19th century? Or
well, I'll tell you this. I think you have to read a variety of sources now to get a complete picture of what is going on. And here's what's changed, Martha, in the part that really concerns me. We now have so many channels that we have what I call validation channels, where people turn on a certain channel or a certain radio show because they know the news is going to be served up to their point of view. Yeah. And if you want it in the conservative way, you watch Fox News. If you want it in the more liberal way, you watch MSNBC. And I suppose there's some place, if you want to hear the vegetarian version, you can find a channel to do that. But here's the deal. If you only listen to Fox, you're going to get one set of facts. And if you only listen to MSNBC, you're probably going to get another set of facts. And what is happening is people are now forming their opinions, but not on the same data.
It's really true, really true.
They're forming it on different sets of data. And I think that is one of the reasons, not the only reason by a long shot, but one of the reasons we have such partisanship now and why these arguments raise on. We're arguing about things, but we're using 2 sets of data to come to the conclusions that we had. And in the days of the old gatekeepers, it was kind of one common set of facts that we were basing our opinions on. And I think that is another very serious thing. But again, going back to this, one of the things that we're all worried about now is, and we talk about a lot, are paper newspapers printed on paper gonna survive. I don't know if they will or not, but I think in some ways that's the wrong thing to be worried about. It's not whether it's printed on a piece of paper or whether you get it on your device. It's the content. Has it been properly vetted? Has it been checked out? Has whoever puts it there gone through the routine that we now expect of the mainstream media to do? And many times they don't, and many times you can't tell the difference. And that is, we all have to be on the alert now. I mean, I would never, ever go with a story that I had only one source, that I picked it up on some blog or something like that. Let me tell you another problem that a lot of people don't think about. And this is a bigger problem for politicians and politics than it is for the media. And that is, our politics now, there's no longer any such thing as the whisper campaign. And when I was a young reporter back in Fort Worth, invariably about 10 days out from every election, you'd get a rumor that somebody had a girlfriend out on the east side, And I don't know why all the girlfriends lived on the east side, but that's where they all lived. And we'd go check these rumors and these whispering campaigns. 90% of the time, there was nothing to it, and you didn't do anything. If there was, we'd think, is it relevant, and so forth. There is no longer in politics now anything called the whispering campaign. It's now, if somebody has some rumor like this to start, they just put it on the blog, and it's out there. It's out there, and then the candidate has to decide, do I ignore this and hope it goes away? Do I deny it and give it wider circulation? What do you do? And you know, they have to decide on a case-by-case basis. I mean, that's pretty easy for us. We wouldn't run anything unless we checked it out. But it's a very, very difficult thing for candidates. We all took a lot of hits for our coverage of Sarah Palin. And all of these rumors were going around. Everybody in politics knew about it, about, you know, her family and all of that. We never wrote a word about that. No, and I don't mean me. I mean NBC, CBS, ABC, the New York Times. None of the mainstream media wrote a word about any of that until the McCain campaign put out a written press release and said her 17-year-old daughter was pregnant. But that is the kind of problem that every campaign now has to deal with. It's these unsubstantiated rumors that get out there, they're on a blog, they're going around, and you know, they become viral. And then what do? I mean, if I libel somebody, CBS is a company that has deep pockets. They can sue, they have recourse. But if somebody just puts out a blog here, and who are they? You have to find out who they are. I mean, what is your recourse if you have been libeled by someone like that? And that, again, is one of the problems we're dealing with, and one of the things that's really changed because of this communications revolution.
Well, and even the mainstream media now can report a blog said.
Yeah.
And then there's no libel risk. You're just reporting a blog said.
Well, no, you can be sued.
Okay.
You can be sued as a second source, but we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't unless, I mean, we might report it as commentary or as one faction says this. But if it were something that impugned someone's character,
of course,
we would not
do that.
We would not do that unless we had checked it out.
Well, you mentioned polarization. You've mentioned candidates. Now let's go for it. Let's talk about the debates. Let's talk about what it was like to moderate a debate, and let's talk about the contemporary debates.
Yeah, well, you know, I did 3 of them, and I did the last one with President Obama and Mitt Romney, and I did the one before with Obama and John McCain, and then John Kerry and George Bush. I always say, I mean, you know, people ask me what are the biggest stories you've covered, and they were in no particular order: the assassination of President Kennedy, Watergate, Vietnam, and then 9/11. Those are the stories that stick with you. But moderating these debates, just from an intellectual standpoint, were the greatest challenge and the most fun. I mean, I just love doing it. And you know, the first one I'll never forget. I mean, 60 million people watch these things, you know, and that's a pretty good-sized crowd when you stop and think about it. And people always ask me, say, do you get nervous being on TV? And the true answer is I don't. I've just done it for so long, then I don't. I mean, I get up, you know, and I might get excited about something, but I really don't get nervous. And kind of the part about, you know, kind of being on TV, not learning to be a reporter, but just, you know, being on TV and being comfortable doing that, is kind of like playing professional sports. I mean, you kind of learn how to play the game, then you kind of learn how to play in front of other people, and then after you've done it a while, you're so zoned in that you forget the people are out there because you're just so focused in, and that's very much the way it is being on TV. But when I was standing backstage before that debate between George Bush and John Kerry, I looked down and I was shaking like a leaf. It was the first time in, I bet, 25 years that I'd actually been nervous, you know, and kind of had butterflies before doing it. I mean, the red light went on and, you know, your professional training kicks in and everything was fine about that. But these are remarkable things because, I mean, when I was standing backstage, I was thinking to myself, you know, I mean, this may determine who the president is because these debates really do move public opinion. And they're one of the few devices left and one of the few things in our politics now that really can cause public opinion to shift. And so you do feel a kind of certain sense of responsibility to do the best possible job that you can. I always thought that the best preparation for doing these things was to be prepared and to do your homework. And I will just tell you, before I did that first debate, I woke up in the middle of the night one night, and I was in a cold sweat, and I had asked every single question that I had written down on my pad, and I looked up at the clock, and I still had 20 minutes to go. No. I was just terrified. So I have always made sure that I had more questions than I could possibly use when I prepared for these. But my little routine for the last debate, about 6 weeks before, I started calling the various think tanks in Washington around town, and I called out to Georgetown, and I would call a think tank and I'd say, who's your expert on cyber over there? And called CSIS was a guy named Jim Lewis. And so I called him and I said, I would just like to find out about cyber, and I just need somebody to bring me up to speed. Could you help me? And he said, of course I can. One of the things you learn is experts love to talk about their expertise. And the fact is, nobody ever calls them and asks them. They write these papers and all that. And they're very flattered when you call and say, I want to know about your expertise. To make a long story short, I interviewed 26 people from the various think tanks. And when I say interview, I interviewed them for at least 2 hours, and some of them for 3 hours. And in only 2 cases, they came to my office. I didn't even have to go to their office. They were so happy to participate in this that they came to me. And the result of this, and then I called, a lot of my colleagues at CBS, of course. I called other reporters. I called Republicans and asked them, what should I ask Obama? I called Democrats and asked them, what should I ask Mitt Romney? By the time we got to the debate, I had 300 questions written down, and it was like going to graduate school. I just felt like I had just kind of tuned up my knowledge of a lot of different things. Now, of those 300 questions, I think I wound up asking 12 or 14, but...
Your nightmare reminds me of, most students have an exam nightmare that they come to the exam not prepared. When you start to teach, you get a teacher nightmare. You forgot to write the exam. It's terrible. Yeah. And so I'm a little bit nervous interviewing you. You're the great interviewer. But I can't help but ask, when you think about debates, is there a format that leads to more information as opposed to posturing and preformed answers?
I really think there is. And I think the last 2 debates that I did with Obama and McCain, and then with Obama and Mitt Romney, and it was the first time we'd ever done it that way. We sat at a table, and they were...
I remember.
They were a little closer on either side of me than you are to me. I mean, I could touch them, and it was
more intimate.
And the fact that it was more intimate, I think, changed the tone of the debate. Mm-hmm. When I did Bush and Kerry, they were standing behind podiums, and it just gave a certain stiffness to the whole thing. And this, they were there, they could see each other, they could see each other's body language. And I think, and we divided the debate up the last 2 times we did it into 6, I think, 15-minute segments. And we told them beforehand, in the first segment, we're going to ask about this, foreign, it was Benghazi in the Middle East. And then the second segment. And, it gave you a chance to actually have a discussion.
Yes.
And I think that was the most... that setting was the most conducive one to encourage a serious discussion. Other people might have different ideas about it, but I'm on the debate commission now, and one of the things I'm going to urge is I think we ought to do all the debates sitting around the table. I also do not like the format, and none of this has been decided yet, of what they call these so-called town halls.
Right.
Where you put a moderator out there and you bring in informed citizens, and they come and bring their own questions, and it never works. It sounds great. It sounds great on paper, but somehow it just never works. And I hope that we don't do it that way this time. I like having a single moderator, but I wouldn't object if you had a single moderator, and then if it was a debate about foreign policy, maybe have some foreign policy expert from someone to I think you need someone who's done this before and is experienced at doing a debate to kind of be the lead person. But I think, I don't want to say informal, but the more relaxed and the more you can, the closer you can get them to one another, I think that really does have an impact on the tenor of the debate. I mean, I wouldn't know how to go about doing one of these debates like you do in the primaries, where you have 11 people on the stage at one time. I mean, because you can't have a serious discussion, and you can't come there. Your main objective in a crowd like that is just to get attention. And, it's like third grade, teacher, call on me. And that's just not conducive to a serious kind of debate.
And there's no follow-ups, and it's all preformed sound bites, really.
Yeah.
Will you comment on anything in the current campaign cycle?
Well, I thought this one last night was an embarrassment. I really did. And, I don't know what the objective was. I don't know what the game plan was, but I don't think anybody came off very well, and I think the moderators came off worst of all. And I think it was
unfortunate.
It was just unfortunate. I don't want to pile on here,
right.
But
what are the kinds of questions the debate commission has before it? What do you decide?
Well, one thing that's kind of interesting about the debate commission leaves it to the moderators to do the questions. They never come to you, we want to ask these questions and that. They pick the moderator and say, you're in charge of the questions. Now, one of the questions that's going to come before the commission this time is what is the criteria? Who ought to be on the stage? And there's a lot of pressure from a lot of different people to change the format, to change the criteria. The criteria is you must be eligible to be president of the United States. I mean, you must be the age, you must be a citizen of the United States, if you're a nominee of your party, and you have to have at least 15% in an average of the 5 leading polls. And this has been the most controversial question that they've had to decide, but we did decide, and they announced it today, that it will be show up 15%. There are a lot of people pushing from the outside that say this eliminates independent party candidates, that they can't meet this criteria. And it ought to be, if you show up at 5% in the polls or something, you ought to be on the stage. Well, people don't understand how many people run for president. I mean, it's an enormous number of people, and you have all of these very minor parties. And the commission's feeling has always been that we're there to put on a debate of the people who are likely to be president. It's not our job to go out and find people. We're not a group that goes out and finds people who might be qualified to be president. I mean, that's up to the American people to do that. And so I think for this time around, we're going to stick with the criteria that we always have had before, 15% in the polls, citizen of the United States. And you also, another rule is you have to be on enough state balance to theoretically have enough votes, electoral votes, to be elected president if that happened. Not if it's likely, but you should
have the possibility.
But it's very, very complicated, and there's many different arguments that people will make, and I'm sure you're going to hear some between now and election day. You always do, but I think this works pretty well. And
how has the change in campaign finance affected both the politics and also what the media can do to?
Martha, I would just say this flat out. We don't have any campaign laws anymore. all of the campaign laws that once that United Citizens thing, once that ruling came down from the Supreme Court, that was the last of the campaign laws. Here's an interesting fact. 32 people were convicted and either went to jail or paid fines by 1975 as a result of the Nixon election. 32 people. Every single thing that they were convicted of is now legal.
Wow.
Every single thing they were convicted of is now legal. Unlimited donations, anonymous donations, all of that.
Wow.
All of that is now legal.
That's a showstopper.
And what this has done, we have now, the system has been now so totally overwhelmed by money that serious people are just no longer many times interested in getting involved. They don't want to do what you have to do to raise the money to get elected. And as a result, the talent pool of people who are now getting elected to public office are the people who are willing to do that. And that means spending 70% of your day begging people for money. And
dialing
going
for
back
dollars.
to the same people to beg them for money again the next day. And that's all that our politics is about. And it's produced a class of politicians that are actually limited. You know, they're not very good politicians. They don't know anything about compromise and that kind of thing. They probably were not very good businessmen or whatever thing they had. But they were willing to just go out and do this. Let me just tell you one little story. When I was 11 years old, the first politician I ever saw was Lyndon Johnson. It was 1948. Dewey was running against Truman. But the big story down in Texas was LBJ was running for the Senate. And we heard he was coming to the vacant lot on the northwest side of Fort Worth where we played baseball. And it was a big event in the community. And everybody, my dad took me down there, and we all went down there. And the reason we all went, and the reason because it was such a huge event, is we heard he was coming in a helicopter. And none of us had ever seen a helicopter, you know. And so we're all down there, and all of a sudden up in the sky, you know, here's this airplane with no wings and all this noise, and then on this bullhorn, this is your candidate for the United States Senate, Lyndon D. Johnson, I'll be down. I've said later, we all knew how Moses felt when he realized that Burning Bush was talking directly to him. We didn't know if this was God. We didn't know if it was a politician. We didn't know what in the world it was, but we'd never seen anything like it before. And then this thing lands in this big cloud of dust and everything, and Johnson gets out and he made this stem winding speech like politicians used to make when they had to hold a crowd. You know, they had to be able to make a good speech because people would wander off. They wouldn't listen to them. And most of the time, most of the politicking was done at public rallies. They don't do that anymore. You know, it's not cost effective. But anyway, at the end of all this, Johnson made this speech, and he took off his hat, walked up to that helicopter, threw his hat out to the crowd, got on that helicopter, and flew away. And, you know, I can't remember any campaign commercials from the last campaign, but I can remember a good part of that day. It made such an impression on me, and it was just great. And I later told this very story to Jake Pickle, who was a longtime congressman from Austin, who replaced LBJ in the Congress when Johnson went to the Senate. And Pickle said to me, he said, "Oh yeah," I said, "that was my job in the campaign." And I said, "What?" He said, "Well, I was a student at the University of Texas," and said, "My job was to drive around to wherever that helicopter was going to land." He said, "Lyndon," he said, "he was the tightest man in the world. He wasn't going to waste a hat on a political rally." So he said, "My job was to stand on the front row, and when he saw me, he'd throw the hat to me. I'd run around behind the helicopter, give it to him, and then they'd fly away. And I'd get in my car and drive to the next stop." But it is such a great story. But I love to tell it because it is such a contrast with the politics of today. You know, he came to our neighborhood. We got to see what he looked like, but he got to see what we looked like. He knew who the people were on the northwest side of Fort Worth, and there there was a certain intimacy between candidates and the people they were trying to represent in those days. The other part is that every single person who had a part in bringing Lyndon Johnson to that vacant lot that day did it for free. They were all volunteers. They all had an interest in politics. Maybe it was in their interest to be for Lyndon Johnson. Maybe they just liked Lyndon Johnson. Maybe they just were Democrats, whatever it was. They were there as volunteers. They did all of the advance work. They did all of the publicity and all of that. Today, and this is the only industry that I know about, we have managed to outsource what we used to get for free to people who charge these enormous amounts of money. And if anybody can tell you that the caliber of politicians we're getting in both parties right now is any better than it was in those days, you're welcome to your opinion. But I just think that's wrong. I mean, and I just think back in how everything is different now. You know, you find out who you're representing, you go out and hire a pollster, he can give you the demographics of every community, and you know, you get the speech guy who tells you, you know, this is what you need to say and all of that. And every time we have professionalized some part of our politics, to my way of thinking, it is made the candidates themselves further away from the people they're trying to represent. And now, with the gerrymandering of these congressional districts like they are, you know, in those days, our congressman from Fort Worth was a guy named Jim Wright. He later became Speaker of the House. He was a great congressman for the city of Fort Worth. He knew everybody in the city. Everybody knew him. Now, I think Tarrant County is divided into 5 congressional districts, something like that, one of which runs all the way down to the county line of Harris County, which is where Houston is, 400 miles away. People don't know who their congressman is anymore. And so if a guy can get together the money to run the first time, then the second time he runs in as an incumbent, and he has this ability to raise money just because he's the incumbent. And so you know, nobody knows who their congressmen are. These districts, some of them are so narrow that, you know, you get in your car and you open the car door and it's outside the district. But they've just been gerrymandered in this way, and so these guys just keep getting elected and keep getting elected. And that, again, I think is one of the things that's really changed.
Well, everything you've just described really raises questions about democracy and whether it's viable anymore, whether this is democracy. Is this about the people, or is this about, I remember the book, Selling the Presidency, about Nixon.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no democracy, there's no guarantee. I mean, our democracy has lasted longer than any other one, I think, up to this point, but there's no guarantee on any of this. I mean, I think it's going to last. I think we're a strong country, and I don't think we're at the end of the line here yet. But, I mean, we can't take all this stuff for granted. And if we can't find a way in Washington to start governing in a way other than the way we're doing it now, just, you know, lurching from one threatened government shutdown to the next, there's no way we can remain a superpower. This is just not how superpowers take care of their business. And, you know, I hope we find a way, and perhaps we will. But right now, I'm really very discouraged about the state of the things.
I have just a few more questions, and I'm going to open it up here. But one is about the public interest obligation for broadcasters. What does that mean? What does it mean to have a public interest obligation for broadcasters, but not for cable and not for all the other new media? Is there no public interest obligation at all in media?
It's just, we're now, you know, broadcasting is just one segment now of this vast communications world that we're all dealing with now. I mean, who knows the difference between broadcasting and cable? No, you know, most people wouldn't even know what the difference in that is, except when, you know, they can't get the cable guys to come out and, you know, fix their television set or whatever it is. But I do think there is an obligation. We've got to find something different. We've got to find some way, you know, to regulate this money that keeps coming in, because you know, we're in a situation now where the last federal election cost $7 billion. The last presidential election cost $2.5 billion. Both candidates last time out spent $1 billion apiece, and I would guess they're going to spend $2 billion apiece this time around. One person gave Ted Cruz $11 million. 8 people have given Hillary Clinton more than $1 million. The New York Times did a piece the other day, 158 families in the United States, a country of 300 plus million people, 158 families gave 60% of the campaign donations that have been given to various candidates. There's just got to be something wrong with that. As my mother used to say, it doesn't have to be illegal to be wrong. And that on the face of it, it's just wrong. It ought not to be that way, and we've got to find some way to regulate all this. Ronald Reagan in 1984 won in a landslide and did not attend one single fundraiser in 1984. That shows you how the situation has changed. Now, you did have public financing in those days where the government gave each candidate $30 million, and they agreed to stay within those limits. Now, this ability they have to raise all this money, nobody wants. Everybody says thank you. I don't want it, and we have what we have. But I mean, stop and think about it. Think about it if you knew somebody and you really liked them and everything, and you'd made a little money, and you decide you want to give them $100,000. So you do. Well, you're about 87th in line to get in to see your guy. Because somebody up here is giving him $11 million. Where do you think you?
Wow.
I tell you, the one thing that Donald Trump has said during this campaign that I totally agree with, and I think he nailed it. He said, when I was a businessman, I gave money to all of them, and he said it worked. So,
wow.
And I think that's exactly right. I don't think these people that are giving these enormous sums of money just want better government.
Yeah.
They might want a little something extra.
Some people call congressional jobs starter jobs because you have that job and then you go become a lobbyist and you earn more money.
That is another thing when we're talking about how politics has changed, and that's absolutely right, Martha, in the sense of, it used to be that people came to Washington and they are elected to the Congress, and if they stayed for a while, they got to be a committee chairman, and that was it. That was the pinnacle. You felt real good about it, and then you retired. Now these people are coming to Congress, and they're serving 2 or 3 or 4 terms, and they go out and accept some big lobbying job. I mean, even elected office, it's making all these consultants wealthy, and boy, they are making a lot of money, and so are television stations. I'm kind of biting the beak, the golden beak here when I say this, but they're not the only ones getting rich anymore. Now, people who serve an elective office are getting rich. They serve 3 or 4 terms, and then they become the head lobbyist for the drug industry, which probably pays about $5 million a year or something like that. Elective office is now seen as a path to wealth. And again, I don't see that that's how our system of government was supposed to be the purpose.
Let's come back to media. Is it possible to be fair in covering a political story?
Absolutely.
And how can you do that with something other than, on the one hand, this person says this person says that?
Well, the way you do it is by giving the other person a chance when you're doing a story about somebody, and this guy says he's the worst person in the world. You go ask the guy who's been accused of being the worst person in the world. But here's the thing, Martha. It is much easier to be fair than it is to be objective. I don't think anybody is totally objective. Where we stand depends on where we sit. We all have views, unless you're on life support system. But it is much easier to be fair, and that's what professional journalists are supposed to do. And when they're trained right and follow the right guidelines and have the right ethics, they are. And sometimes the news is not what you want to report, but it happens to be what the situation is. And people need to find that they need to know what the truth is. They need, and that's what we have to do. Politicians go on television to deliver a message. Our job is to go on television and somehow or another do the best we can to find the truth. That's the difference in the two. And there's nothing evil about either one. There are still some really good people in politics. There's some good people that are lobbyists. Yeah. These are all all parts of the American system. But the whole thing has just been so totally overwhelmed by this money that it's corrupted the whole thing.
My last question is, what do you watch? Do you watch television? Do you watch cable? What do you watch?
You know, it's interesting in that I used to not watch television at all. I watched sports and I watched the news, and I never watched primetime television. But the fact of the matter is there is some very good programming on television now. And you talk to actors, and I have some friends that, you know, that are in the entertainment industry. They all say it's all about television now. It's not about the movies anymore. The jobs are in television. There's great writing. We have these programs like Homeland and Downton Abbey and The Good Wife and
The Newsroom.
And The Newsroom. I'm not going to put that on my list, but I'll let you put it on there, Martha. But there is good programming on the entertainment side now, and you know, my wife and I find ourselves probably watching more television than we ever have. Now, we don't go to the movies much anymore. And I'll tell you something else. If we don't rein in this situation with guns and stuff, people are going to stop going.
Yeah, that's really true.
Because, you know, they don't feel it's safe. And I mean, that's not why I don't go to the movies, but I think I have to say it's something I think about.
Yeah.
You know?
Gabby Gifford spoke here at commencement, so we have her very much in our minds, yes, in our hearts, yes. Okay, questions, comments? Who wants to ask one?
Sure. Way back in the back.
Maybe you can identify yourself, okay?
Hi, my name is Cicely Deng. I'm a 1L, and I actually was working as a TV anchor and journalist back in China.
Really?
So, yes. So
That's
it's
great.
Very exciting for me to be here and listen to your comments. I think the Chinese government is now placing more and more importance on government spokesmen. And we are trying to learn from the US, where spokespersons are usually very sophisticated when it comes to dealing with the media. And I want to know the other side of the story, because you've covered main Washington assignments, such as the White House and the Congress. And how do you try to build a functional dynamic with a spokesperson? And more importantly, how do you get the information from them which they did not want to reveal in the first place?
By talking to other people. You know, one of the things that I learned when I covered the courthouse back in Fort Worth, I learned out that if you wanted to find the best stories about the sheriff, you went and talked to the county commissioners. If you wanted the best story about the county commissioners, you went and talked to the sheriff. You know, and when I got to Washington and my first assignment was covering the Pentagon, I quickly discovered that I didn't know anything about military strategy. I mean, I'd been in the Air Force and all that, but I didn't know anything about military strategy or anything like that. But what I realized was the Pentagon was a big courthouse. So if you wanted to find a story about the Air Force, you went and talked to the Navy sometimes. For example, if you wanted to do a story about the true cost of putting an aircraft carrier online, you didn't go to the Navy. You went to the Air Force. And I tell you, they had it down to the penny. They could tell you how many support ships you had to have. They could tell you all of the support. And they could give you the true cost of putting an aircraft carrier online. On the other hand, if you wanted to talk about the vulnerability of land-based aircraft, you didn't go to the Air Force, you went to the Navy, and they could give you the real story on that. And what it is in any large bureaucracy, when you have people competing for the same tax dollar, you always go to both sides. You don't just go to the person who's going to get the money. You also going to go to the person who's probably not going to get the money if these guys get the money. And that's what reporting is all about. And that's what I loved about being the Capitol. I was a Capitol Hill correspondent for 15 years. And what I loved about it, unlike the White House, where everybody talks to the same works for the same person, on Capitol Hill, they're all private, freelance contractors.
Yeah.
They all work for themselves. And so it's very easy on Capitol Hill to get two sides of the story, and that's the only way you can develop the story. is if you have two sides. So you'd go to the official spokesman. That's part of the story. You find out what the company line is, and then you go talk to some other people to see what they say about it. And often when there's somebody on the other side of the issue, if you talk to them, they'll tell you what's wrong with the argument that the guy just made. And I know it's different in China than it is here, but you kind of go about it in the same way. And I congratulate you. Are you going back? You're not sure?
We're glad you're here.
Well, we're glad you're here. Okay.
Who's next here?
Hi, how are you? My name is Yassine Altik. I'm a third-year law student here. Thank you.
You're what?
A third-year law student.
Uh-huh.
Just introducing myself. I want to thank you for mentioning The Good Wife. I actually do think that's one of the best television shows right now. But I actually have a question that isn't exactly fully developed, so I was wondering if you could just kind of bear with my ideas a little bit as I try to articulate it. So I want to unpack the Kardashian effect for a second here, because you were suggesting, at least through your narrative of approaching the helicopter that Lyndon B. Johnson came down, that there was some type of connection that you felt to him in that moment. Yeah. And through Instagram, right, I think about how we can feel connected to the interpersonal aspects or features of a celebrity's lifestyle. And Hillary Clinton posted on her Instagram a picture of Katy Perry's nails that said Hillary 2016, right? There's this intimacy that we can have with people in positions of power through social media. And it appears as if you might have been suggesting that politics is now more performative, but perhaps in a way that our country has never seen before. We have an accessibility to, for example, President Obama when he imports into BuzzFeed a quick little snippet of himself reciting a speech before a mirror. So we're developing some kind of connection with these politicians that we haven't had before. And so the question I have for you is, when we imagine that someone like, Kim Kardashian has 3 million followers, and with the snip of a photo, she can connect to that many people. How do we try to compress our understanding of how social media is driving politics, driving government, and certainly informing and impacting our future generations and their ideas of politics? Well, so I hope there was a question in there somewhere.
I'm kind of digging around in there, and I think there is a question in there. I just have to tell you about the Kardashians. I have no idea what that's all about. I mean, this idea you can be famous just because you're famous, and it's fine. I don't have any problem with it, but I don't understand any of that. But I do understand what you're talking about it is possible, to kind of get to know people and feel like you know a little something about them through things like Instagram and all of that. And it's also fun, I mean, there's fun. I have these 14-year-old twin granddaughters, and they spend a lot of time on things like that, more time than their mother wants them to spend. But I think those things are kind of fun. But the other part of it, the kind of the dark side of this access to power that we all now have, is that under the cloak of anonymity, you can be rude, you can be obscene, you can be simply awful. I can't tell you some of the mail, not mail, but the messages that when I did the last presidential debate, and it was increased by a factor of 12 over the previous time. You can't imagine how awful some of this stuff is. And I mean, I know what these kids are going through in high school now with all these likes and dislikes, and people are sending them anonymous notes, and I'm a grown person, But I mean, I'll just say one of them, some of it was kind of funny. Some of our staffers were showing me afterward, when the debate was starting and somebody was emailing and said, "Who is that old guy?" I said, "Is that one of those old guys on the Muppets that makes fun of the other characters?" And I mean, that's one of the nice ones. I got to tell you, what made it all worthwhile, though, was when one woman or somebody put on the web that I was the Brad Pitt of Boca Raton. Fresh meat for the ladies of Boca Raton. That's a big retirement community. I said, I can take some of the other if I've got to get that. But
gosh.
The idea, I mean, this is one of the things that I think really is discouraging people. They don't want to be a part of that. And some of this is just so harsh and just so brutal. And I don't know what we're going to do about it. I mean, it's there, and it's part of where we are today. But we're going to have to work ourselves way through it. And I wish it's an excellent question. And I wish I knew a better answer, but that's kind of my thought on it.
Couple more?
How about this man up here on the front row? He got here early.
Hi, Mr. Schieffer. My name is Bob Bordone, and the question I wanted to ask you maybe relates a little bit to money and big media.
Money and what?
Money and big media. So CBS News, NBC News, New York Times, and also relates to some of your statements about beat journalism. So many eons ago, I actually interned at CBS for Rita Braver.
Really?
And Rita was a great beat reporter. So
Yeah,
she was
she's
at the
a really
Justice
good friend of mine.
Department. And the way she worked sources, the relationship she built, enabled her to break the kinds of stories that were investigative, like real news.
Yeah.
And that costs money.
Yeah.
And it also means that a company needs to take some risks, that needs to insulate the news division from the entertainment division. And so I think about the kind of work that she does, or you did, and some of the great correspondents of CBS News, and then think about some of the controversy around something like the new movie that's coming out, Truth. Or tomorrow we have Colin Powell speaking here, and we're going to be looking a lot about the start of the Iraq War and the role of the New York Times and maybe not being quite as aggressive in its reporting for whatever set of reasons. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of maintaining kind of journalistic integrity, the investing enough to be able to do, whether it's investigative journalism domestically in Washington, or having foreign bureaus open where there can actually be reporters doing reporting instead of file film and narrators in London
Well, now,
or New York.
to start with the foreign films, number one, I mean, we have some of the best foreign correspondents, and one who just left and went to work at CNN, and I was heartbroken, Clarissa Ward. They just basically made her a deal she couldn't refuse. But Laura Logan, Holly Williams, and what's interesting about it is they're nearly all women now. Our key people as CBS reporters are mostly all women. I guess the guys have all become investment bankers or something, but we have women. I mean, when you got to think about when I came to work at the Star Telegram, they didn't let women even be on the city side. They were all over at what we call the society department, and they wrote about weddings and things like that. And they didn't make as much money as the men, and there are still some gaps. But you know what? There are more women in law school now, right?
Nationwide, that's right.
Yeah, there are more
And medical school.
women in medical school now, and down at TCU where I went to school, 70% of our students in the journalism communication school are women, and as it is with most private universities, the women outnumber the men by 60-40 or something like that. Women are really making their mark, and they're going to be running everything pretty soon. I mean, it's just the natural course of events. But
what about this blurring of the entertainment side versus the news side of big media?
Well, I've got to say, we don't do that at CBS. I mean, we do maybe on a regular basis. We do a story at the end of the broadcast that we hope would make you smile after you've heard a lot of awful news that came before it. But a lot of times we get people mix it, because people don't really know the difference. They mix up national news and the national news programs with the local news, and we don't put car wrecks on the air. I mean, we do if it's a national news effort, but we pretty much, if you go back and look at the stories we cover, I think it's a pretty serious newscast.
Well, CBS is the gold standard.
Yeah, I hope it is. And I'll just make one comment on the movie. It was a very tragic period at CBS News, and basically the story was not ready for air. They hadn't checked it out, and I don't care how good the story is, how much you love the story. If you're going to challenge someone's character, call them a liar, coward, you got to be ready. You got to have something to back that up. And they thought they had the evidence, and it collapsed. It turned out that the documents they had were forgeries, and so it was a story that should not have gone on the air. And I mean, I really don't have much else to say about it. I haven't seen the movie. I don't know what conclusion it comes to, but that's the way it was. And we did an extensive investigation and tried to make corrections, which we have to do. I mean, there's no way you can maintain your credibility as a news organization when you make a mistake and don't correct it. And I think we corrected it.
Last question.
Yes, sir.
My name's Raj. I'm a 1L here. As someone who's interested in going into politics eventually, and I know you sort of talked a lot about perhaps how it's not as idealistic as it once was, and I'm optimistic and perhaps naive that it still can be.
Well, I hope it
what
is.
advice
I
do you
hope
have?
You do.
Okay. So, like, what advice do you have for someone who's thinking about going into politics
Do
one
it.
day?
and I mean, become involved in campaigns and, try to decide what you believe in. And, there's no use to run for public office unless you're going to try to do something. I mean, it's not enough. Your ambition should not be to be elected to the Congress or your ambition would be to get to the Congress so I can do certain things. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt, he ran for the presidency because he had some ideas about how he could make things better. It wasn't that he just wanted to be president. And I think too often now the objective of a lot of these people that get into public office is is to be elected and then not have a primary opponent. And I guess that's okay, but check your history book. I haven't found many people that made the history book because they didn't have a primary opponent. Most of the people that were there were willing to take risks and tried to get something done. And
do you have advice for someone who wants to be in politics about how to talk to reporters?
Be honest. If you can't tell them something, say that I just can't talk about that. Sam Nunn, who's one of my favorite people and was always my favorite guest on Face the Nation, I would call him some Sundays and I'd say, Sam, you want to come be on Face? And he would say to me, I just really don't have anything to say this week. Check with me next week. And I really appreciated that, and that would be the advice. I mean, when I go up to talk to these kids on Capitol Hill that are press secretaries, they say, what advice should I have to tell my boss? And I say, if they don't have something to say, then don't try to get them on one of the Sunday shows, because if they're just coming on to get their face on TV, they will look evasive. People know when a non-answer becomes an answer, and it hurts them, and that's what you don't want to do. But, if you can explain to a reporter why you're doing something, he will appreciate that. And he may not agree with you, or he may think you're absolutely wrong, but don't try to BS them, I guess would be one thing I would say, because they've been reporters, most of them, for quite a while, and they see that right off. But just be yourself and be for something, and let that be the reason that it's like when people say, I want to write a book. Well, what do you want to write about? I don't know, I just want to write a book. Well, then you shouldn't write a book. You write a book because you've got something you want to say. And that's the reason you ought to run for public office. And I hope you do, because we really need good, serious young people to do it.
Bob Schieffer, your service to this country is remarkable, and your service to democracy, your service to truth. Thank you so much for being here at Harvard Law School.
Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you.